I'm Katie von Holzen, IASCL's media coordinator, and today I have with me Dr. Fred Genesee, Professor Emeritus of the Psychology Department at McGill University. He is best known for his work on bilingual language development and has made significant contributions to education in his studies of language and literacy learning in immersion programs, dual language education, and second language learning. His service to the fields of bilingualism and child language are evident in his roles as president, vice president, and executive board member of the TESOL Association, so Teachers of English to Speakers of Other Languages, as well as executive committee member of IASCL. He's won the Canadian Association of Second Language Teachers Lifetime Achievement Award and the Canadian Psychology Association Gold Medal Award, and most recently, the 2024 IASCL Roger Brown Award. Fred, I'm so glad to have you joining me today. Welcome. I'd like to start.
Pleasure to be with you.
I'd like to start at the beginning and ask you how you found your way to study psychology and especially to focus on language acquisition. So, what attracted your interest in bilinguals and more specifically to study this as a topic of investigation?
Well, I suppose it all started when I was actually in high school. It was rather serendipitous, but in my high school, they had a program every year for graduating students where they gave you the opportunity to meet people working in different professions. And I remember quite distinctly talking with somebody at this careers night, as they called it, who was involved in psychology, as professional psychology. And I was quite taken by her and by what she had to say about studying human behavior and why people behave the way they did, and trying to explain all of this. At the time, and I didn't really realize this, she was clearly coming from clinical psychology, and I didn't realize there was really a difference between clinical psychology and theoretical research psychology. But in any case, when I applied to go to university the following year, I had to register in a specific area my second year at university, and I chose psychology because I was interested in pursuing this further. And then while I was in this program, it was sort of rather fortuitous, we had to do a research program as part of our degree and a research project as part of our degree. And I chose to work with a woman who was studying language in the brain. And this really fascinated me. I'm not quite sure why, other than the fact that I was really intrigued by the possibility that psychologists were studying how the brain functioned, and in particular, how it represented language and how it actually processed language. So I did a project with her for my undergraduate degree, and this then led to my application for graduate studies. This was a woman who was very well known, Dr. Doreen Kinnear, was very well known in the field of language, brain and language, which was a relatively new field of inquiry at the time. This was in the late 1960s. And she had been a student of somebody who worked at the Montreal Neurological Institute. So when I applied to do graduate studies at McGill, I was taken on by her mentor, and that sort of began my career in doing research on language acquisition. So it was all rather fortuitous, but it ended up in the right place. And of course, the work that Dr. Milner, who was the researcher at McGill, her research, because it was on brain and language, that really intrigued me. And I actually didn't pursue that at the time. I switched to work with Dr. Wallace Lambert, who was a researcher in bilingualism, as many of you probably know. And I just, for some reason, I'm not quite sure why, I wanted to pursue something that was more developmental in nature. And so I worked with Wally on bilingualism. And then it was only later that I actually came back to doing research on language in the brain. So that's a rather long story, but that's how it went.
Interesting, and I'm very glad that you made that discovery.
Well, I think my switch initially from working at the neuro more directly with language in the brain to working with Wally Lambert was that the work that he was doing at the time was on the French immersion programs in Montreal. And he had done a lot of other research on bilingualism, but that was the hot topic at the time. Wally was a very eclectic researcher, did lots of research on lots of different aspects of bilingualism. But I think that I was really interested in the idea of doing research that was not just focused on doing something in the laboratory, but research that produced results that actually were relevant to the lives of people outside the laboratory. And his work, and Dick Tucker, who was really my thesis advisor, doing this research on the French immersion program in Montreal really sort of suited me at the time.
Yeah. Out of curiosity, did you have what was your language instruction like at school? Did you have a?
Well, good question. It was very conventional. I was always interested in languages in high school. So I studied French and German in addition to Latin, if you can believe it. I mean, I actually taught Latin in those days. And everybody thought, well, studying Latin was good for your mind. But I studied German and French, and it was taught in very conventional ways. I had very good teachers, but they focused on vocabulary and grammar. And I remember spending hours declining French and German verbs, and gender of different words, and so on. But I was quite intrigued by it. I think that for me, learning languages was also a way of opening up myself to different people in different cultures. And it was very conventional, in contrast to the immersion approach, which was really to learn the language by using it. I learned it by practicing it, basically, which is really antithetical to what immersion was.
Very cool. So to kind of pull us back to your progression through your studies, so you applied to do graduate work, and eventually you earned your PhD in psychology from McGill, and that was in 1974. So 50 years ago this year.
Right.
Happy birthday to your thesis.
Yes, thank you. I'm glad you pointed that out. That anniversary had escaped me, so that's great.
Oh, yeah.
No.
Cool. Yeah. Which we were also celebrating the 50th anniversary of IASCL. So
Right.
in good company. And so your dissertation was titled Bilingual Education, Social Psychological Consequences. So I'd like you to kind of think back to yourself as this newly minted PhD and think about what that person would think about our understanding of child language acquisition as well as bilingualism and learning today. What would that person think?
Well, that's a really interesting question because at the time that I was doing the research, I started to do my doctoral research. It was when most people were doing language acquisition research, it was really focused on monolingual children. There was very, very little research on bilingual children of any age. I suppose there was quite a bit on second language acquisition in adults, but I was much less interested in adults and much more interested in children because it seemed to me that children gave you insights about the biological foundations of language learning and bilingualism that you couldn't get by looking at adults. Now, and people were not so interested in bilinguals at the time. They thought that monolinguals were really the way to understand the human faculty for language learning. And there was very little on bilingualism. So it was ripe for exploration. And of course, because I had been aligned with Wally Lambert and Dick Tucker, I kind of got aligned with research in education because they were doing a lot of evaluations of the French immersion programs. The other thing that I guess influenced me was at the time that I did this research, it was focused on Piaget's research. And Piaget was very current at the time. Nobody talks about it anymore, but it was very current at the time. He talked about how language development was influenced by cognitive development and vice versa. And I thought it would be interesting to look at how these relationships played out in children who were learning two languages, not just one, because Piaget's work was all on one language for children. So certainly one thing that's changed between then and now is that there's a much broader focus now in the field of language acquisition. People are very interested in bilingual acquisition, especially in children, but also in adults. And they're also interested in children and adults, but children in particular who learn languages under very, very different circumstances, different developmental circumstances and different environmental circumstances. And that's a huge shift from the environment in which I was studying. The other gigantic change over the years has been the range of technologies that people use to study language acquisition. At the time, all of the research was really behavioral. So the main method of investigation was to collect language samples from children, or to test them in a way that elicited language samples, language tests really, and to try to understand their language development using their behavior. But now we have all this incredibly sophisticated and wonderful technology that allows us to study children that doesn't rely on their behavior per se. So we have eye movement research, we have basic kind of digital scan technologies, all sorts of stuff that you can do to study children, even before they are actually producing language behavior. So that's a really exciting development, and it means that young people going into research really will probably move in those directions, because there's some exciting stuff coming out of that work. At the time, it was much narrower, and now it's much, much broader. There's a wealth of research, and especially on everybody is interested in bilingual development these days, whether it's in normal developing children or children with language development disorders. But it's very current.
Yeah, so we've expanded our umbrella in terms of what we're interested in as a field, and also our ability to investigate those things.
That's right. Yeah, definitely. So it means that young students really need in a sense, a broader repertoire, both of knowledge and of methodological technology behind them. But I think that's a good thing, because it opens up more doors for them.
Yeah, it allows you to kind of get a broader sense of all of the different ways that development can happen, right?
Yes.
By including all of these different contexts or different ways in which learning can take place.
Yes, that's right. Definitely.
Yeah. So I'm curious, because I would probably say your bilingualism research is what you're perhaps best known for. And it sounds like when you were beginning, this wasn't really something that was a focus of research. So what sparked your interest in researching bilingual education? And is there a way that you can maybe tie that with your progression over your career to your more current focus, which is on the more neurocognitive aspects of bilingualism?
Well, yeah, again, it's sort of rather fortuitous as I about this, because I had been doing a lot of research on language development and academic development in school-age children. And that was actually quite popular, because the immersion programs were really big news in a sense, because educators were looking for more effective ways of teaching children second languages. But at one point, I was actually asked to write a chapter on children who grow up learning two languages. And I was not familiar with that research, and I thought, oh, well, this is really interesting. And so I decided to write that chapter. I explored the research, and I was quite surprised at how little research there was on children who grow up bilingually, even though it seemed to me there were lots of children who would grow up in those circumstances. And the most interesting thing about this project, in a way, was not only that, but also when the book finally came out with my chapter and other chapters, it turns out that most of the title of the book was Language Development in Exceptional Circumstances. Now, in fact, bilingual development is not exceptional.
No.
You know, argued that more children grow up bilingually than monolingually. But the other thing that was really quite interesting to me was that all of the other chapters in the book are focusing on children who are learning language, either monolingually or bilingually, under circumstances which put them at risk for language development. So these would have children with developmental disorders, so forth and so on. And here in the midst of all this was my chapter on children growing up bilingually. And in my chapter, I argued that there was nothing to be worried about with these children. But what I did find in my review of the few studies that had been done is that there seemed to be a kind of consensus at the time. So this was in the late 1980s. There seemed to be a consensus that children growing up bilingually were actually initially monolingual. And they treated the two languages as if it was a single language, and then only over a year or two did they learn to separate the two languages. So in this sense, and there was a general zeitgeist that learning a second language at such a young age actually put children at risk for incomplete language development or deficient language development. So it cast bilingualism in children in a rather negative light. And that really got me going because I can't believe I can't believe that the human brain has evolved to the point where it's only capable of learning one language, and that learning two languages is really burdensome and going to put children at risk. Because it seemed to me that one thing we did know even then at the time, that the neurocognitive system was remarkably flexible in how it processed information, learned, developed, and so on. So that set me going on doing research on children in situations where they were learning two languages from birth. And, you know, quite frankly, part of my agenda was not only to understand how they did this and how it compared to monolingual children, but also really to dispel, if the evidence indicated that, dispel the myth that bilingual put children at risk for language development, and that there was something burdensome about learning two languages from birth. So that again, it sort of appealed to my interest in looking at doing research that was not only theoretically relevant, but also was relevant in the public domain, in a sense. And that's really been, in some ways, kind of characterized a lot of the research that I've done on different kinds of language learners. Looking at children who are often regarded as being at risk or being deficient in comparison to monolingual children.
Yeah.
Find out, is this true? And in order to do that, it became important to try and understand better how they actually acquired language given the circumstances that they were in.
Yeah, definitely. So actually going in and not actually studying them, actually looking at them in context and seeing the success, seeing that they're developing, you know, I always describe bilingual language development as a different kind of normal.
Yes, that's right. And that's right. And people really felt that, and parents in particular really worried about raising a child bilingually or trilingually because they thought that there would be costs involved. They saw it as a zero-sum game in a sense, that acquiring French along with English would jeopardize one or the other or both languages if that were the case. And it wasn't really well proven that that was the case. And so the early research that I did set out to look at that. And of course, now there were other people starting to look at bilingual children at the same time. And slowly we showed that no, this was not the case, that bilingual children can learn two languages as naturally and as easily as one if they were given the right learning environment.
Yeah, definitely. Our view of bilingualism has changed, obviously, as a field, and we're also starting to have an impact on society's understanding of bilingual language development. So in the past decade or so, you've started to study or started to focus more on a very specific kind of bilingual, and that is internationally adopted children. So, what led you to study this particular population?
Right, that's a good question. I think my primary interest in them was, once again, they had not been studied very much. And it seemed to me that this was really an interesting group of children because they were an example of very early second language learners. And so indirectly, they were related to the whole issue of the critical period hypothesis, that there's a critical period during which you can acquire a language, a first or a second language, easily and completely. And then after that period, it becomes much more difficult and often less successful. And I thought, well, everybody's looked at the closing of the critical period, but what about the other side of it? How much of a delay in exposure to a language can children experience before they start to show differences from acquisition of a language from birth? And bilingual or internationally adopted children seemed like an interesting case to look at that, especially children who were adopted from China, because these children, first of all, there are quite a few of these children being adopted at the time. China's now just changed this policy. But they were interesting because they were raised in, relatively speaking, quite favorable adoption environments compared to other children who were adopted internationally. And furthermore, they were adopted, they were given up for adoption for reasons that did not really implicate developmental problems.
Mm.
And these children often abandoned because the parents are unable to support the children. Many of the children are given up for adoption because there's drug-related problems or other kind of problems with the birth parents. And so these children find themselves in an adoption environment. And that's not true, or so true in China, because these children were given up for adoption because of the one family, one child policy. So these children were interesting because they were relatively healthy. They were being raised in relatively favorable adoption environments, institutions. And furthermore, they were learning an additional language with a delay that they weren't learning the first language. So it was like what people refer to as acquisition of a second first language. So that the second language, which was, say, English or French in our case, was a language that really was equivalent to their first language because they were no longer learned or exposed to or learning the first language. So it struck me as a really, really interesting case to look at whether what is the effect of delay on language acquisition. But it also is an interesting case of looking at the effect of having been exposed to a first language, but then discontinuing exposure to that language. Does that impede subsequent language development, or does it facilitate subsequent language development because you're required to language during this critical first year of life? Or is there something about this prior exposure that actually makes the acquisition of the new language like a second language? In other words, the issue is, this is rather complicated. Is the acquisition of the adopted language like a first language, or is it like a second? I mean, that's... So I had some students who came in who were quite interested in doing this, and along with them, we did quite a few studies actually on children who were adopted from China. And in contrast to some of the earlier research, we restricted the age range of the children we looked at. There had been quite a bit of research on these children, and from a primarily clinical point of view, because the concern was that these children were at risk for language development. And they're somewhat difficult to get. The age range of the children in these studies was very, very broad. And the assessments of these children was often based on their performance on standardized tests rather than in comparison to monolingual children or bilingual children. So we started to do a series of studies, and it turned out to be extremely interesting, actually, much more interesting than I think I originally imagined. I mean, just to highlight one of the findings that we found. It was really quite remarkable. I had a student, Lara Pierce, who was interested in the sort of neurological aspects of this group of children, as was I. I was interested in knowing whether the acquisition of their adopted language, whether it was like, as I said, did it look like first language acquisition or second language acquisition? And she was interested in whether there were any traces of the first language, even though they had discontinued exposure to it. So we did a number of studies with Denise Klein at the Montreal Neurological Institute, where we did scans of these children's brains when they were 16, these children when they were 16 to 17 years of age. The adopted children had been exposed to French starting around 1 to 2 years of age. And we looked at their acquisition of Chinese, or the processing of Chinese, when they were 16 to 17 years of age, in comparison to another group of children who had acquired Chinese as a first language. They continued to use Chinese and learn Chinese, but in addition, they acquired French as a second language around the same time as the adopted children. And we also compared them to monolingual French-speaking children. So we wanted to see, by making these various comparisons, what was there any evidence that the acquisition of Chinese or exposure to Chinese still was evident in the way they processed the stimuli we exposed them to neurologically, like first language learners, or was there no evidence of Chinese at all? And what we found, interestingly, was when you gave them certain tests in Chinese, even though they didn't know Chinese by the time we tested them, their neurological processing of Chinese was identical to that of the children who had acquired Chinese as a first language and continued to use it. So these children gave no behavioral evidence that they knew Chinese at all. There were neurological traces of Chinese in their brains, in a sense. And then to make the story even more interesting, when we looked at their processing of French, the question was, are they going to look like monolingual French speaking? Or are they going to look like monolingual second language learners of French? And they actually looked like second language learners of French. Well, they had started to learn French around 2 years of age and were exposed exclusively to French for 15 to 16 years by native speakers. They were processing these experimental tasks that we gave them, the same as second language learners of French, not like native speakers of French. So our argument was the evidence of remnants of Chinese really got a lot of international attention. Really, people were really interested in this. And our argument was that their exposure to Chinese had actually affected the structure and processing of their brain, so that when it came to learning French, even at this very, very young age, they were actually treating it somewhat like they were using some of the same systems as the monolinguals, but systems that were different from the monolinguals. So it was, we believe that it was really the exposure to Chinese in the first year of life that influenced how they learned French, and in fact learned it somewhat like a second language. So it really highlighted to us the importance of the first year of life, that during that first year, children are born, as we all know, children are born with the capacity to speak any language and learn any language. And so their brain is ready to do that. But it also means that when you expose them to language during that critical first year, it actually changes the structure and processing of the brain. And that in turn influences how they learn and use another language, so that they are unique language learners in a sense. Because when we looked at language development behaviorally, we found that for the most part, they looked like monolinguals. But underlyingly, the neurocognitive evidence was suggesting that they're not processing that language in exactly the same way as the monolingual children. So again, it reinforces the point that you made and that we were interested in, is that there's more than one way to learn language. And you can look like a monolingual, but you may not be processing the language in the same way as a monolingual. So it really gave impetus to our notion that we really need to broaden our notion of what it means to be a language learner. That monolinguals are not the only language learners that we should be studying. We think it's during the first year of life that the children's fine-tuning their brains to certain phonological systems. So what we feel that the children were doing was that they were acquiring some of the phonological principles of Chinese, and this altered the structure of their brains so that when it came to learning French as a second language, they were using that Chinese-based system, but because it was Chinese and not French, they had to pull in additional systems in order to master French, and they were mastering French. There was no difference in their performance on these tasks, but they were doing them differently.
Yeah. And
so it really speaks to the flexibility of the neurocognitive system of young learners.
Absolutely. And this also reminds me of what we were talking about earlier, and that through technological advancements, we can discover these kinds of things, right? Behaviorally, right? Not distinguishable from French monolinguals, but if we kind of take a closer look into the brain, we can actually see that there's different processes at work.
No, that's right. Without all of this technological development, we wouldn't know these things. That's right. That's right. And that's why looking at different learners has become very exciting, because there's different technologies that you can use to study them. The behavioral evidence can be deceptive. You need to really dig deeper.
Yeah, definitely. I'd like to kind of talk about a slightly different topic, and I have a feeling that this is one that would have shown up in this this book that you contributed a chapter to, language acquisition in exceptional circumstances, I think is what it was called. Yeah. So you've recently published a number of research reports on children born with congenital deafness, and I have a feeling that was probably a chapter in that book. What kind of led you to be interested in this particular group of learners, and how do you think that this, definitely differently or maybe similarly to your studies on bilingualism, how does this contribute to the broader field of language acquisition?
Well, this is really research that was really initiated by one of my graduate students, and now a very good colleague, Audrey Dusson-Suri. She really initiated this research, and she really conceptualized and carried it out. The motivation for studying these children was multifold, I guess. One of them is that sort of duality of theory and practicality, that there's a lot of controversy about language development in children. And in particular, children who are born deaf of parents who are not deaf themselves. Nowadays, they can have a cochlear implant, and for some children, this actually gives them access to oral language, and then they go on to learn oral language. But there's a lot of controversy about whether these children should be exposed to sign language before they have the implant. So most children don't get the implant until they're 12 months of age or older. And then the implant actually doesn't become operative right away. It takes some time for the child to be able to use the information they're getting. So in some circles, there's the belief that these children should not be exposed to sign language prior to the implant, because exposed to a signed form of language will interfere with the acquisition of an oral form of language. And this is actually quite widespread belief, especially actually in clinical or educational circles. On the other hand, there's the argument, and we would make this argument based on our research from the internationally adopted children, that exposure to any form of language in the first year of life is important, because what it does is it gets the neurocognitive capacity for language learning going. And that if there's a critical period, and there's a lot of controversy about critical periods, if there is a critical period, in my mind, the critical period happens during the first year of life, not when the kids are 13 to 14 years of age. So that if they don't get exposure to any language, then we risk the mechanisms that make language learning possible, difficult to access and use. So that argument would be these children should be exposed to sign language during the first year of life, even though the parents' preference and these children might ultimately be exposed to oral, because you really need to activate those underlying neural systems. So the latest studies that Audrey has done, and I've helped with that to some extent, was really interesting because she looked at the effects of exposure to sign language during the period prior to the implant, where the input is actually from parents who are not deaf themselves, but are using a non-native form of sign language. Because the waters get very muddy when you talk about this issue, because there's the general issue, should you expose them to sign language at all? And then there's within that, should you expose them to sign language that's not native language? Because what happens in these families is many of these parents begin to acquire sign language themselves so that they can use it with their children. But of course, this has to happen very quickly. And most of them don't acquire fully native-like competence, obviously, before the child has the implant. So Audrey did this brilliant study where she looked at children who had some exposure to non-native sign language during the first few months of life in comparison to other deaf children who did not have exposure to any sign language because the parents didn't know language and they felt it wasn't going to be helpful. And she found that it was helpful for these children who have had exposure to non-native sign language during the first year or so of life. It facilitated their acquisition of oral language in comparison to children who didn't have that kind of exposure. So this is a real game changer in a way, because it really represents what we're trying to do is what can we find from research and how does that impact practice? So it really suggests that in clinical settings, parents should not be discouraged from using sign language, even non-native sign language, with deaf children, because that can facilitate the development of oral language. And of course, we know there are lots of benefits to being bilingual, so there's no reason for these children not to continue learning and using sign language as they acquire oral language. So the research was really motivated partly by our interest in, well, what goes on with these children? There's, like a lot of these children who are in exceptional circumstances, there's a lot of mythology about what is good for them and what's not so good for them. But there's not always good empirical evidence. So we wanted to fill some of those empirical gaps. But we also wanted to provide some guidance to parents and practitioners who are working with these children. So this was a good example of the kind of research we like to do.
Definitely. I always think about this. I don't have children of myself, of my own yet, but I like to think about this as it's scary enough being a parent. And I think that it's a really great service that we can do to society to kind of alleviate some of those concerns and show them like, no, this is okay.
Yeah, it's tricky,
Yeah.
we don't know as researchers trying to provide some guidance, we don't know everything we would like to know, and we don't know as much as parents would like us to know.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, as I say, I've become convinced over years and years of research on these kinds of children that the problem we face is giving them research evidence that's still in development versus giving them guidance which is based on no evidence at all. And this has been, I hate to sound so arrogant about this, but my experience has been a lot of the common sense notions people have about language learning under different circumstances is not well founded. And so parents and clinicians and speech and language specialists are being given advice that is really not in the child's best interest. I think the biggest mistake we make with children is we underestimate what they can do, whether it's in an educational setting or whether it's in a home setting. They are capable of much more than we think they are. I remember years ago reading an interesting book on language development by a French author, and she said, rather than being surprised about what children can do. We should be surprised about what they can't do. There seems to be nothing they can't do. No. So that sort of motivates my interest and I think my graduate students have sort of taken that on too, is that we need to take a more positive view and look at what children, the capacity view of language learning, rather than knowing thinking that there are limitations in these children. So we're trying to open the tent in a sense.
Making that big umbrella grow bigger.
Yes, that's right. That's right.
So I'd like to switch gears a little bit. After all, this is an IASCL interview, and talk a little bit about IASCL, which, like I mentioned before, recently celebrated its 50th anniversary. And to celebrate, we asked members to submit their wishes for the future of child language research. So also at the same time, in a view towards the future, the IASCL established a new award this year, the IASCL Early Career Award, to honor more junior exceptional child language scholars. And the first recipient, Dr. Wayna Garcia, gave a plenary talk in Prague at the 2024 Congress titled Casting a Wider Linguistic Net, Language Acquisition Insights from an Austronesian Language. So my question to you is, thinking about the future and kind of the directions that the field are going, what would you wish to be for the future of child language research?
Well, I wholeheartedly support the goals of the most recent recipient of the Young Scholars Award. I do think we have to cast the net wider, and I think we have to take a more positive view of different languages with the view to really understanding and documenting what children in different circumstances, developmental, environmental, can do, and with the view to understanding what they can do and help them do whatever they're trying to do, help their parents, help their teachers, and so on. I think that we're maybe hopefully moving into an era where our notion of the theory of language acquisition is going to be a universal theory of language acquisition that is going to encompass language learning under very, very diverse circumstances. So my wish is that young scholars will contribute to that overall goal. That we're not comparing. And this brings us to the issue of the monolingual bias, which is so in our theory. There's concern about comparing diverse learners to monolinguals because often those comparisons result in negative evaluations. Now, I think actually comparisons with monolinguals are inevitable and they can be useful as long as they're done with the view to taking these diverse language learners evidence for its own sake, that whatever they're doing represents the capacity of these learners under diverse circumstances. And that in turn tells us about the capacity of the human faculty for language learning. So rather than siloing our theories around monolinguals, I think my view is it would be great if we could move towards developing a universal theory of language acquisition that encompasses different kinds of language. And monolinguals, of course, would be an important part of that, but so would be these other groups. We've talked about internationally adopted children and children who are born deaf, but there's also children with developmental disorders, there's children who third language. There's lots of variation out there, and all of these children have something to tell us about what the human brain is capable of doing. So if we take a more positive point of view and a more integrated point of view, I think that would be great.
Yeah, no specific group of children has more or less to tell us about how children develop and learn language. I like that kind of as you say, positive view.
It's really interesting when you look at these diverse learners. It's almost impossible to stop children from learning language. No matter what kinds of challenges they or their parents might face, children learn language. And there's that interesting research out of South America that looked at children who were put in institutions if they were born deaf. And these children developed their own language. And then they taught it to other children who brought into the institute. So there seems to be a biological imperative learn language. And that makes sense because language is the way we connect with one another. Language is the way we connect and view our world. And it seems almost impossible to stop children from doing that. And they can be remarkably successful if we widen our lens enough in that endeavor, even though they face considerable challenges in many cases.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, resilient little learners.
Yes. Definitely.
So I think perhaps unsurprisingly, you as well as Dr. Elena Lievin both received IASCL's 2024 Roger Brown Award. This was established in 2011 to honor Dr. Roger Brown, who many acknowledge as the father of modern day research on child language. This is a highly prestigious award, and it's conferred every 3 years to outstanding researchers and leaders in the field of child language. I think our conversation alone demonstrates why you were such an excellent recipient of this award this year. So congratulate on this award this year. And so congratulations on receiving it. And I'd like to ask you what it means to you to receive this award.
Well, I can't tell you how delighted I was and surprised, actually, but I'm truly delighted. And I'm delighted not only for myself, but also for colleagues who were really in the, when I started my research in this, there were other researchers who were also contributing. Jürgen Meisel, for example, now a lot of European researchers and North American researchers. And in Asia and so on. And so I'm delighted on behalf of all of us who have been working on especially bilingual acquisition, which was really, I think in some ways, the pioneer in opening the doors more widely. Because in the early days, this was not research that was really widely regarded. I remember taking some research findings we had that we got from English children who were learning these 2 languages from birth. And we were looking, this is research done with Joanne Harity, my graduate student of mine at the time, that these children were acquiring grammatical properties of English and French that, according to universal grammar, were contradictory. And it was hard to explain how they can do this according to universal grammar. So I took this to a linguist colleague of mine and with some delight I showed him these results, but he was particularly unimpressed. And he seemed to sort of brush them aside because they were bilinguals. And what does this have to do with our pursuit of understanding language? Because monolinguals were the gold standard. So I think I really like to accept the award, and I'm delighted to accept the award on behalf of everybody who realizes that there's more to language learning than learning one language. You can learn more than one language, you can learn in different circumstances. So this is really a very valued recognition of the utility and value of that kind of research. And it's not just me, but it's a lot of my colleagues who really deserve credit for that as well. And I'm also delighted that, as we talked about, it gives value to doing research that might serve parents and educators who are. One of the delightful things about doing research on language development is that educators and other kinds of professionals often value what we do as researchers. That's not always the case in the research field. So it's wonderful to have the respect of educators, parents, clinicians, and so on. But in order to keep and garner that respect, we need to be able to provide them with really strong evidence-based research. And I think increasingly we're able to do that. It's, all of us who work in this field often get requests from parents and educators. Can you help me? My child or my class has these kinds of learners. What do I do? And we can't serve as clinicians because we don't know these circumstances precisely. But we can help them understand what the research says, and that in turn we hope will help them make the best decisions they can. So on behalf of both the theoretical side of language acquisition research and the pragmatic side of it, I'm delighted this award was given to me.
So just now, and as well as during your acceptance speech that we heard in the business meeting in Prague this summer at the Congress, you said that you accepted your award on behalf of parents, educators, and clinicians, and referencing again there as well their role in putting research findings into practice. So I have a feeling that this has been something that's kind of shaped your focus over the years. So what did that look like? Did you have direct collaboration with different schools or different clinicians? So how did that relationship unfold?
Well, yeah, that's a good question. I mean, it certainly motivated a lot of my research and my students' research. I think we've always had an eye on what what is an interesting question, and let's try to find answers to those interesting questions. As one of my graduate student mentors said, if it's not an interesting question, it's not worth doing well. You have to ask important questions, and I think we've tried to ask important questions, both from a theoretical but also from an applied point of view. So it's been a major force in the research that I've done and my graduate students have done. And I think a lot of language acquisition researchers feel that way about it. How do we help people make informed decisions, and how do we fight some of the myths that really don't work in children's best interests? But in doing that, of course, as you said, to do this research, we've had to work closely with schools, parents, parent organizations, and so on. But I do think a major challenge in this whole endeavor is how do we reach parents and educators? I think that there's still, despite everything I've been saying, there's a huge gap in what we're doing and what we're able to convey to parents and educators. I don't think we're as successful in getting information out to parents and educators as we could be or should be. And it's not easy because it takes, it's a full-time job. And we're doing research and mentoring students and so on. But I think that this is an area where IASCL maybe has a role to play. How do we disseminate what we're doing in ways that are understandable and useful for non-researchers? I mean, the research is valuable in and of itself, but in my opinion is it's much more valuable if it can have some impact on how we raise children and educate children. And how to do that is a whole other endeavor, a whole other challenge.
Yeah, that sounds like a good wish for the future, having more direct impact on parents and educators' interactions with children. I'll bring
Yes,
it. I'll bring it to the
there are
higher ups at
individuals.
IASCL.
Yeah. Well, you know, there's the Multilingual Matters or Bilingual Matters website that comes out of Scotland and Hitler, I believe, is it? And that's useful. I mean, I think these are really, really very useful undertakings, and I think we need a lot of that. And Francois Grosjean's blogs about bilingualism are extremely useful. And the more we do that, and the more we learn how to do it successfully, the better.
I agree. So, in all of my interviews with senior scientists, I ask them a specific question. And this also goes with IASCL's mission of supporting early career researchers of child language. So, my question to you is, what advice do you have for early career members of IASCL?
I think I would certainly encourage them to stay in the field of language acquisition. It's a wonderful area of research to work in. I find that people who work in this field are incredibly collaborative and congenial. That is a great environment to do research. But I would also encourage them in their own research to collaborate with one another, whether they're students or faculty members. Reach out to work with other people, because it's a more creative process, and it's likely to produce a better studies. It's more fun to learn. It keeps you honest in a sense too. And certainly do what interests you. Research is hard work. we see the finished products and research reports, but actually getting the research done, especially if you're working with groups, as I've been talking about, who are difficult to recruit because they're not as common as, say, bilinguals, you have to really be interested in what you're doing. I would encourage you to follow your passion, but be sure you do it in a way that asking important questions. Don't get lost in the weeds. I think there's sometimes a lot of research that gets bogged down in the details, which is important in the long run, but I've always encouraged my students to ask big questions and to pursue those.
And I'm really glad that you have. Okay, well, that's the end of our interview today. Fred, thank you so much for joining me. It was wonderful to get to know a little bit about your history, what has shaped you, your view on your own work. Congratulations again on winning the Roger Brown Award. And I'll let you go. We can see the sunshine coming in through your window. So why don't you go out and have a wonderful day and enjoy that?
Well, thank you. It's been a real pleasure.